Hello everyone, and welcome to our Spotlight webinar, Get the Most Out of Your 360 Survey Reviews. My name is Sandy. I am the Training and Event Specialist at Survey Gizmo, and I'll be your host today. Helping me on chat is Alita Hubble, Survey Gizmo's Training and Events Manager. Hi Alita.
Hi everyone, my name is Alita, and if you have any questions, please send them to us via the chat. If it's something the entire group can learn from, I will send it over to Leanne and Sandy. Otherwise, we'll either answer you directly back in the chat or we'll follow up via email.
Thanks, Alita. Yes, that chat box is in the lower left-hand corner, so any questions at any time, just put your questions right in there and we will get to them. We have a 360-degree feedback expert with us. She will be sharing her tips on how to create a culture where managers, employees share the same common goals and work together to meet them. Before I introduce her, I want to go over a few more housekeeping items. For an optimal experience, if you are using VoIP and on Wi-Fi, we recommend that you dial in. If you are tweeting this event, and we hope you are, please use the hashtag #HR @SurveyGizmo @NewMeasures. You will receive a recording of this webinar and the slide deck tomorrow morning. I am excited to introduce our guest today, Dr. Leanne Buehler, Managing Partner and VP of Consulting Services of NewMeasures. NewMeasures is a consulting firm focused on leadership, culture, and engagement. Leanne has 20 years of professional experience in industrial and organizational psychology. She is responsible for helping organizations achieve results through the use of innovative survey tools that align stakeholders' experiences with business objectives. In her role, she works with senior executives to build strong cultures that are aligned with the strategic direction of the organization. Her strong facilitation style, coupled with a deep analytical skills, gives her a unique insight to make a measurable impact on culture, leadership, and the employee experience. Welcome, Leanne.
Thank you, Sandy. Good to be here.
Before we get started, Leanne, I have a poll for our attendees. Just want to know how familiar our attendees are with 360 survey reviews. Attendees, if you could answer this question, does your organization conduct traditional employee performance reviews or 360 survey reviews? Perhaps you do both. Just let us know by selecting one of those options. We'll get to the results here. I'm going to give everybody another minute. Wow, looks like we're split evenly across all three, 33%. Well, that's really interesting, and I'm glad you're here today because you're going to learn a lot from Leanne. I just have one more quick question. If you're not doing a 360 survey review, do you plan to switch from a traditional to 360 employee reviews in the future? Yes or no there? Gives us a better idea of how many are new to this. So yes, 66% are planning to switch from traditional to 360.
Interesting.
And Leanne, I start with that because you shared an interesting metric the other day about that number, where you saw, was it 75% are switching?
Yeah, actually, what I see here in this poll reflects what we're seeing in a lot of the research that's out there that suggests that 360 surveys are used in several different ways. So we saw that with the poll here. We also know with some research that's out there from Burke that nearly 75% of Fortune 500 companies are using 360 feedback. So it's definitely something that is very prevalent, and even more and more we're seeing smaller and medium-sized organizations switch to this methodology as well.
Very interesting. Well, maybe you can help me understand the benefits of a 360 review. How does that really differ from a traditional performance review?
Sure. So with a traditional performance review, it's typically focused on a supervisor giving an employee feedback. Whereas with a 360 performance review, we are opening up the feedback to a broader variety of raters. And by raters, I mean these are the people who are giving feedback on the survey. And the term 360 is talking about feedback that's coming from a supervisor, peers, and traditionally direct reports. So you're getting a more well-rounded view of how that person is performing.
So from all angles, from below, beside, and above. Hence the name.
Hence the name, yeah. And in fact, some organizations include other stakeholders like a mentor or a coach or perhaps customers. So there's a lot of ways that you can incorporate feedback from different perspectives.
Well, I'm going to let you just share your statistics and your great tips with us. I think we have a lot to learn here. We have one more question, and that is, would you use both a 360 and an employee performance review?
Yeah, I think you can. It depends on the goals of the organization and how talent management is viewed from a more strategic perspective. One thing I would think about, though, is to use different tools and surveys if you're going to be using them both for development purposes and for more decision-making like succession planning, raises, promotions. And the reason for that is because we've heard from many of our clients sometimes 360s get a bad rap when they're used for decision-making and development because it's kind of jumbling the purposes there. So I think they can play a part in both processes. We just want to be really clear about how you're doing that.
Right. So as any survey, it really depends on what your goal is.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay. Well, so for our time today, I wanted to share some tips on if you are going to be implementing a 360 process, how do you get the most out of it? And there's really 3 different ways to think about this. One is, what questions should you be asking? How do you design your survey? The second is, what is the process that you're going to use to collect that feedback? And then finally, once you've brought in or you've collected that feedback, how do you support people who are receiving it so that they get the most out of it? Before I dive into that, I also want to talk about the power of 360 surveys. So I mentioned that nearly 3/4 of Fortune 500 organizations are using this process. So why is it? What's the value here? So one thing that we know about how the human brain works is that 95% of what we do is unconscious, it's pre-programmed. We're not always aware of our behaviors. And there's actually really good reasons for this. This allows us to be more efficient. So if you think about a simple example of it, if you had to tell your body every time it needed to take a breath, that'd be all you'd be doing every day, right? So this allows us to be more efficient, but what it also means is that we're not always aware of how we're showing up in the workplace. And a key important element of development and behavior change is self-awareness. And so part of the power of a 360 tool is that it can help individuals understand how they're being perceived and be closer aligned with those perceptions so they can think about, is that really what they're trying to accomplish, and be more conscious about making the changes that they want to. And, building on that, a lot of times when we talk to individuals going through this process, there can be some anxiety or, getting feedback is not always the easiest thing in the world. But I like to set the tone for this type of initiative by reminding people what a gift it is to receive feedback, and that the organization is investing in your development because they see your potential, they're committed to your growth. And so if you go into it with that mindset, you can use it in a much more constructive and positive way. A couple other benefits of a 360 process. We talked about building that self-awareness, and this is not just about understanding what you need to work on and where you have opportunities. It's also about understanding what we call your genius or areas of strength, which is really important to understand about yourself because it allows you to leverage those those strengths in other areas, which ultimately will help leaders and individuals be more effective. Also, we know from our research that the best leaders have a really good balance between getting results and valuing people. And most often we tend to lean towards one of those or the other. And as I'm sure many of you know on the call today, there's a common thing that we see in leadership where people are really good at their role as an individual contributor, and so they get promoted to a leadership position, but they may not have had time to develop those skills around valuing people. And so a 360 tool, if you're asking the right questions, can help you to understand that balance between getting results and valuing people. A couple other benefits, 360 can really help to support leaders in their development and personal goals. It also sets the tone of having regular, honest conversations and starts to normalize the process of giving feedback. Right, so when you have folks that are being proactive about asking feedback, it just becomes part of how we work, and it loses some of the scariness about giving feedback. And then the last thing, it also gives you an opportunity to feed the feedback you've received into a development plan for which you can hold people accountable for making progress in those areas. One quick thing I want to mention, you'll hear me talking a lot about Leadership 360 feedback, and that's because from a study that was done by a 3D group, we saw that the majority of organizations are using 360 feedback for leadership roles. Only 12% of 360 surveys are done around individual contributors. That's not to say that's not a great idea and you can get a lot of value, but as I'm talking today, you'll hear me focusing a lot on this process for leadership because that's how a lot of organizations are utilizing this type of tool.
Well, you just answered my question, and I guess that really makes sense too. A contributor really wouldn't be a 360, would it? Because you wouldn't have anybody underneath reporting to them.
Yeah, that's right. What would that be, a 270?
Yeah.
If you had your
275,
peers
right.
and your supervisor, yeah. But certainly there's benefit in individual contributors, and we're seeing a lot more organizations doing that.
Right.
But the traditional 360 is often used for a leadership role.
Right.
Okay, I wanted to share a framework that we use at New Measures in our 360 tool that is focused on this concept of a strengths-based model, and the way we talk about it is helping people to understand their genius. This model comes from a book called The Big Leap by Dr. Gay Hendricks. And the idea of genius is allowing people to focus on the things that they're best at. These are the things that when you're working on them, time tends to fly by, you're flowing through your day, and it gives you that sense of energy and joy. And so when you're thinking about how to design your 360 survey, think about how you can help people to understand their genius or their strengths. The other parts of this model that you see here, if we start at the bottom, we all have our areas of incompetence. For me, it's anything mechanical. My husband has tried many times to teach me how to change a tire, and it just doesn't make sense to my brain. So I can keep trying to learn that and be frustrated, or I can think about how to build out my team and get the resources that I need to accomplish those things that I'm just not good at. In terms of competence, these are the things this is where we spend most of our time, and these are the things that we can do just fine, but they're not really motivating and exciting to us. So a quick example about this, I had a recent change in my role where I was doing a lot more around managing the finances of our business. And I could do it, but it probably took me longer than it should, and I felt drained by the time I was done working on it. And so one of the things that we did on my team is talk about, here are all the areas of responsibility that we need to cover, and how can we structure our work so that each person is playing to their genius as much as possible. Of course, we're all going to have things in our work that we have to do that are in our zone of competence, but we know that when we structure work based on people's strengths, it's a more fulfilling and meaningful workplace for everyone.
I think that's great. That is just, I think, would be so motivating for the employee to know that, and that by doing this, hopefully I can focus on and get greater joy out of what I'm doing.
Right. A lot of times we think about what are the jobs and how do we fit people into them, but this kind of flips that on its head and says, who are our people, what are they good at, and then how do we structure the work accordingly. And a 360 tool is a great way to understand each member of your team and what their genius is to begin those conversations. Okay, so let's talk about how do you actually do this. So the first piece is really to design your 360. What questions do you want to ask? And so I wanted to share some tips around this. One thing that we know is, I'm sure you've all heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out, right? So if we're not asking good questions, people are going to have a hard time responding to the survey, and then individuals are going to have a hard time understanding and getting value out of the feedback. And so as you're thinking about what questions to ask on your survey, there's two concepts that are really important: reliability and validity. So reliability is, are you going to get consistent measurement out of that tool? So a great example of this is, let's say you go and you stand on your bathroom scale and it says you're 180 pounds, and then you get off and you get back on and then it says you're 250 pounds. It's not reliable. It's giving you a different result every time. So one way that industrial organizational psychologists study this is by doing analysis on how the feedback comes in to make sure that those items are in fact reliable. Validity, on the other hand, is more about, does the tool measure what you want it to? So you could put a bunch of questions together, but if they're not tied back to what you're trying to accomplish with the survey, the competencies that are important for that particular role, it's not going to have a lot of relevance. And so given that reliability and validity are so important to a Quality 360, it's important, or there's a couple of ways that you can go about getting the right content. First of all, there's existing content out there that has been validated that you can purchase in an off-the-shelf form. New Measures is a validated tool. Another option is to map existing content to your particular leadership model or competency model, which is a nice way of leveraging that scientifically valid content, but at the same time making a little bit yours. So that it better supports the brand, the vision, the values of the organization. A third way to do it would be you come up with your own content and have it reviewed by an industrial organizational psychologist or another expert in survey design. Or we also do a lot of work where we're designing surveys for folks from scratch. So it depends on your goals. But those are a couple of different ways to make sure that you're getting good content. What we know from the research, the study I mentioned earlier from 3D Group, we see that about 2/3 of organizations actually work with an outside firm or consultant to get the survey questions themselves. The other benefit of that is typically then you're able to receive normative data along with your survey.
Leanne, I have a question. This just made me think. Based, garbage in, garbage out, do I need different versions of my 360 survey for different levels in the organization? My contributor versus my middle management versus the C-level?
Yeah, great question. So this all comes back to starting with understanding what is required for success in that role. And so what we see most often is that you might have a competency model that lists the knowledge, skills, abilities, and behaviors that are required for success for an individual contributor. And then it changes slightly for someone who's in a management role, because now they're doing some additional things like coaching and mentoring others, giving more feedback. And so you would want to make sure you're tapping into that in your 360 survey. And then from there, we also see organizations use a different survey tool for leaders of leaders, because that requires different skills as well. And then there's often further competency differences for that C-suite that's really responsible for vision, strategy, those types of things. So at the end of the day, it's all about starting with understanding what's required for success in that role and then designing your survey accordingly.
Right. So not one size fits all.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I have another poll we put in here. Does your organization have a leadership competency model? Just wanted to make sure that our audience understands. Attendees, go ahead and answer that yes or no. Just want to make sure that you are basing your questions on that, because that's a good place to start. And look at that, the majority do not have a competency model.
That's interesting, yeah. So if you don't have a competency model, there are places to help you get started. So I know in New Measures we have a validated leadership competency model that we provide to our clients to use as a starting point. And that, you know, the term competency model is less important than knowing what's required to be successful in the job. And so oftentimes one way to accomplish that is to go talk to the people who do the work or the people who lead them and really note down what kinds of skills and behaviors are most critical for success in that role. And that will get you far along the way of understanding what kinds of things you want to measure in your survey.
Right. Start with the planning.
Okay. Let's talk about a few other tips for thinking about your content. So we've been talking about this leadership model or competencies. Another thing that I really encourage our clients to think about in the 360 content is using the tool as an opportunity to promote the mission, vision, and values of the organization. Right, we tend to do what we're measured against, and so let's say your company has a value of fun. Let's make sure we're asking some questions about how we're contributing to that environment. So it's a great way to reinforce, those cultural elements. There's also an opportunity with the 360 survey to be really future-oriented, and so by that I mean thinking out several years down the line in terms of what kind of skills and abilities do we need to be developing for what we know is coming down the road, right? So let's say you know as an organization that you're really going to need to be focused on growing talent from within the company because let's say you're foreseeing a labor shortage. So the idea would be to start now making sure that your leaders have really strong coaching, developing, mentoring skills so that you're well ahead of that curve and building the leadership that is going to take you where you need to be in the future. The last content tip I'll share is the idea of avoiding double-barreled items. And this is simply just the concept of asking about more than one thing within a survey item. So a common example I'll share might be something like this, where you have a survey item that talks about, does this person demonstrate effective oral and written communication skills? So this item is double-barreled because we're asking about two things, both oral and written communication. And the problem is, it's hard for people to respond to that because what if you're good at one but not the other?
Right.
And then the individual gets that feedback, and let's say you respond neutral because you're not quite sure how to answer that, that person isn't getting targeted, specific, useful feedback. So instead of asking the question that way, we would suggest breaking it out into 2 different items focused on one topic. So just think about that as you're reviewing your questions to make sure that that's not happening with your items. One other topic you may consider as you're designing your 360 survey is this idea of incorporating the behaviors that lead to trusting relationships. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because some of you might be familiar with some of the research that's out there from folks like Stephen Covey and the Speed of Trust, or Horsiger, who's been doing work around this topic as well. And they have found some really compelling evidence that shows that when organizations have a strong foundation of trust, things just flow more smoothly, and ultimately organizations are more successful. So why is that? Let's say maybe you misspeak in a meeting. If there's trust there, people aren't going to question you. They're going to give you the benefit of the doubt and move on. Whereas if there's low trust, it can turn into a thing where people are trying to guess what you meant, or they're not assuming your best intentions, and it's a distraction. So one of the things that we've been doing with many of our clients is incorporating the competencies that contribute to trust within the 360. So let's talk about what that could look like. Trust is a big topic. There's a lot that goes into this. And here you can see some of the different elements, and they range quite a bit from consistency to relationship building to getting results. What we know happens most often is typically a leader is doing most of these things well, but there's just that one thing that they could work on that would really help to strengthen the trust within their relationships. And so a 360 survey is a great opportunity to help people understand that and build more awareness around their behaviors. All right, so that's enough about survey content. Let's change into what the process looks like. So how are we going to set this up so that it's successful for the people who are completing the survey as well as the person receiving the feedback? So the first thing is to be transparent about how the survey feedback will be used. So as we started out, we talked about how some people are using this for managing performance and making decisions. In other cases, it's used for purely development purposes, and as some of you shared, a lot of times we're using it for both. But the idea here is to let people know ahead of time why the process is happening. Along those lines, it's also important to share who's going to see this data. Is the report just going to go to the individual who is receiving the feedback? Is it going to HR or a coach? Is it going to someone's supervisor? And just being clear and transparent about the process can reduce some of the anxiety around this. Communication is also a really important piece of this process. So of course we've communicated with the people receiving feedback about why they're doing this, but we also want to think about how we are communicating to the people who are being asked to provide the feedback. And a couple best practices that we recommend are first to have the person receiving feedback send out an email that says, I'm going to be going through this 360 process, this is why, and I respect your opinion and I would love to hear from you. And we know that that can go a long way to boost participation rates. Then after the survey feedback has been collected, it's also a good idea to have those individuals send out a thank you to the people who were invited to respond and share a couple things about what is it that they learned, what were a few key takeaways, and that just helps to close the loop and again sets the tone for it's okay to talk about things that we're working on and to be a bit vulnerable.
Well, Leanne, that makes me wonder. I always assumed that it was HR who was administering the 360. So you can give the employee control And does it let them decide who to invite?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of times it depends on why the survey is being done. But we do like to have the person who is being rated give input into who should be included in completing the survey, because they are in the best position to know who is most familiar with their performance. As a general guideline, we recommend inviting all of the individual's direct reports, their supervisor, and then between 3 to 10 peers. But sometimes we do see a HR or a supervisor signing off on that list, just to make sure that the individual will be getting a well-rounded view. Not just the people who have great relationships with that person, but people who might be able to share different perspectives as well.
That's interesting. I mean, as an employee, it would give me much less angst knowing that I had some control, right? But at the same time, you as an administrator wouldn't want me to invite, just my favorite colleagues. So
exactly, yep.
It's a little bit of a balance there.
Exactly. And so, continuing to talk about the raters, it's really important that we give some kind of guidelines or training for the people who are going to be providing feedback. And the reason for that is because these are human beings making judgments, right? And we bring our own bias to the table, whether we mean to or not. And so there are different ways of going about this. Some organizations provide rater training. Others just provide guidelines in the survey instructions. But a couple of things that you want to make people aware of, you've probably heard of the halo or horns bias, where I've interacted with you and you did this one thing really well, and so that colors my perspective to think you do everything well. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily accurate feedback. So we want to remind people of that so they can catch themselves. And a few other things to keep top of mind is think about the individual performance as a whole. So you may have had a really poignant interaction with this individual last week, and that's sticking in your brain, but we really want people to think about performance over time. Also, we want to be balanced in terms of sharing feedback along the lines of strengths and opportunities. And we want people to provide feedback based on their personal interactions with that individual. Sometimes you hear things through the grapevine, what someone did in a situation that you're once removed from, and that's where you can start to get some distortions in how you're giving feedback. So stick to what that person knows in terms of their direct interactions. Also, we want people to be honest and respectful, especially if you have open-ended comments on your survey. And so that means being careful to use words like always or never. Mm-hmm. That's very rarely accurate. And to keep it focused on the behavior versus the person. So you would want to say something like, you missed several important deadlines, as opposed to, you don't care about this project. So you're keeping it more fact-based, more observed behavior.
More neutral.
That's right. And then lastly, to remind people, focus on the questions that we're asking you on the survey. Sometimes we see people use 360s as an opportunity to rant about things that might have nothing to do with the feedback that we're trying to share with this individual. So just keeping them focused on the topics at hand is really important. Okay, so we've talked about survey design, the process. To me, the most important piece of the survey process is how are you going to take action on the data. And receiving 360 feedback, it can be really personal, right? You're putting yourself in a vulnerable situation where you're asking for people to really judge how you're doing, and that can feel intimidating. And so as you're thinking about your process, the most important thing is how are we going to support people once they've received their feedback. One thing to set up for folks before they get their survey report is to remind them the choice that we have in terms of responding to feedback. So it can sometimes sting a little bit to get this information, and it can take you to a place of focusing on the things that the feedback suggests you need to improve upon. But really, we want to look at this from a positive and constructive lens. So a month or two ago, I received some feedback from a fellow coach who was giving me input on some things that I could do better to present data to my clients. And he had a lot to say, and it was a little hard to take. And I remember leaving the meeting feeling a little bummed and like, I don't think he liked any of that, just questioning, my performance on that project, and just feeling a bit frustrated. And I really had to make a cognizant effort to flip my perspective and remind myself, wow, he just spent an hour trying to help me improve my performance. And again, what a gift. But I had to be really conscious about saying, okay, how can I use this to my benefit, learn from it, incorporate some feedback, and work toward that continuous improvement. So reminding people of that before they get their results can just be something helpful so that it stays really constructive. As I've been saying, getting 360 feedback can be a pretty emotional process. And there's some of you might be familiar with the interesting work that David Rock has been doing. He is a neuropsychologist, and he's been researching how workplace interactions impact the brain. And a lot of what he has found is that the brain is a very social organ. And the reason for this goes back to our evolution, where we were living in tribes, and it required us to get along well with those around us for our survival. And so our brain is wired to want people to like us, to feel accepted. And interestingly, when people receive feedback from other folks, it's igniting the same parts of our brain that tend to be used when we're hungry or we feel pain. And so this is it's a physical thing that's happening when we get feedback. And so knowing that can be helpful as you are processing your 360 report. And so a couple tips to help people deal with those emotions is, number one, appreciate the feedback for what it is. It's one piece of information amongst many, so we really encourage people to think about what's consistent about other things that I've heard about my performance, what might be surprising to me that I want to go get more information on. And again, keeping in mind these are other people's perceptions, which, as we know, are their reality, and it's also a development opportunity. One strategy that has worked for me, I don't think this is the best, works for everyone, but it's my style, is I get my 360 report, I read it, put it in a drawer, leave it there for a week, and kind of just let the emotions process. And then I can come back and I'm in a better place to say, okay, what are the key takeaways here, and what do I want to focus on for my own improvement? Other folks, they know, might have a different approach where they get it and they want some support there right away, someone to talk to and process it. And so it's important to think about the individual differences of how we all like to respond to things and give people the opportunity to do what works best for them.
Right. So would you ask the employee during the planning process, do you prefer to see the results on your own first and then have a meeting? Would that be a good idea?
I think you could. One piece that we'll talk about here is the importance of having someone to coach you through the results. Mm-hmm. And so a good coach will help to understand what are this person's preferences so that we can use this process in the most effective way possible.
Yeah, I really like the coaching idea. It is kind of like a survival game. You feel like you're being attacked, with the feedback if it's negative, right? So it's natural to want to react and defend yourself, right? So that's, I think, a really hard piece is learning to just let it simmer. But I think, too, from a coaching perspective, you have to keep reminding the good. It's so easy to get stuck on the negative, that person just focusing on that one negative comment and not remembering the other good pieces.
That's right. And that's why a coach can be so helpful, because they will keep that balanced perspective. And related to this last bullet on this slide, that can be a great strategy for people as they're thinking about their feedback, is to challenge that individual to think, if I were coaching someone based off of this feedback, how would I recommend that they respond? What would I suggest that they pay attention to? And that can put you in a more neutral, less emotional frame of mind. This next piece is exactly as you said, focusing on the positive, those areas of genius, as much as areas of opportunity. We talked about why that's so important. Also, if you are including comments in your 360, it's really important to remind people not to put too much emphasis. A lot of times there's that one comment that perhaps sticks in our brain, and it takes away from really the validity of the rest of the data. So the comments can give you good context and ideas and further understand the feedback, but take them for what they are. It's one person's perspective.
Question for you there, Leanne, regarding those comments. Do you share the exact comments, or do you paraphrase so as to, one, try to keep them more anonymous, but two, maybe less hurtful too, if there was some emotion in that feedback?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't clean the comments, and part of that is because as an outside consultant, it's hard for us to know what things are being said that would be clues as to who somebody is. So instead what we do is be really upfront to let people know that comments will be reported verbatim, and we give those tips on how to provide constructive, meaningful feedback. But certainly I've heard of other organizations that do some cleaning. Okay, the last thing here is when people are reviewing their feedback, it's important to keep the bigger picture in mind. So I like to ask leaders to start by articulating what is it that they're trying to accomplish, both for their personal career and within their current role. Because sometimes we get feedback that we are weaker in areas that may be less critical for accomplishing our goals, right? So if we go back to my example about my ineptitude around mechanical skills, that doesn't impact my work on a daily basis. So it's less important for me to try to work on that. So keeping that big picture in mind and what areas you need to excel in to be successful is really critical. Okay. Another part of this follow-up process that can be really powerful is encouraging individuals to share their results with others. So what we see most often after a 360 survey is that the report goes directly to the person for whom the feedback was provided. And we do see that you can get a lot more out of it if you're willing to share the feedback either with your manager, your peers, your direct reports. And what you can do there's different ways of doing that. You can actually give them the report, or some people are more comfortable just saying, here are a couple of themes or things that I want to understand better. So you can ask folks can you give me some examples to help me understand where I might have shown up in this way? Again, it helps to contribute to building that culture of giving each other feedback. It's okay to be vulnerable. And another thing that I've seen work really well is, let's say you're sharing your feedback with your direct reports. Let's say you learned from the survey, I tend to interrupt. You can add, I worked for a boss who actually was working on not doing that. And what he did was he put a rubber band around his arm, and he asked his team, just snap my rubber band if I interrupt you. And it made it fun and playful, but it still helped him to be more aware. So using ways to ask others to hold you accountable can be really, really powerful. Okay, we talked for a moment about coaching, and in my view, it can be a bit dangerous just to give someone their 360 feedback without any support, because as we've been talking about, there are emotions in this process. So a coach, it can be someone internal to the organization. It might be an HR business partner. It could potentially be your supervisor, or it can be an external coach. In the study that I mentioned from 3D Group, we saw that 2/3 of organizations were doing their coaching with internal resources, and the other third were using outside coaches. But these folks can help to keep the conversation constructive, make sure the data is well understood, and help people hone in on that one area of focus and get faster to what do we want to do in response to this feedback. And for those of you who have worked in this capacity before and have done some coaching, we've seen a wide variety of reactions. We have some leaders who give themselves the highest possible rating on everything, and that's an indication of a lack of self-awareness. And so the way you help that person respond to the data is different than some of these other reactions. We've seen people say, well, it's not me, it's the questions were bad, or people are punishing me because they didn't like a decision I made. We hear sometimes people have reasons, well, I have to do it this way because of whatever kind of context is going on. One of the hardest ones, I think, as a coach is the individual who says all the right things, but then they don't do anything differently. And then lastly, of course, avoiding conflict is another classic response. So a coach can help to address some of these challenging conversations and make sure that we end up in a positive place. One last thing to consider in your follow-up process is you may want to give your leaders some support tools. So we have a very simple follow-up guide that we share with individuals that helps them think through their results, gives them tips, and ultimately ends up in a development plan. Okay, so we just to wrap up, I wanted to talk about a couple of common pitfalls that we see. From time to time, we hear of clients that are interested in using 360 feedback as a way of addressing poor performance. And so a couple of things here. So if you already know somebody is having performance issues, doing a 360 survey is really just kicking the can down the road. And it can feel disingenuous too if so, you know, sometimes we hear people are trying to validate perceptions of poor performance, but if you already know there's a problem going on, it's best to address that directly. Providing a normative comparison can be really important. We know on 360 surveys that people tend to be skewed in a positive direction toward the feedback that they provide, and so I've seen situations where leaders, let's say they're getting 4s on a 5-point scale for all their competencies, and they may think, see, you know, I'm doing awesome, where really, if you understand how other people, either within the organization or external to the organization, score on a particular item, it can help you to ground you in really understanding the feedback and to what degree it is positive. We also, a common pitfall that we see is sometimes with these projects, the survey itself is the thing that we plan for and it gets a lot of attention, and then we forget the part of what comes after. And so how do we support leaders so that they have what they need to be able to take action on the data? And along those lines, this idea of leadership development, it's not a survey event, it's an ongoing process, and the tool itself is great measurement to check in and see how you're doing, but having that continuous view of development is going to get you a lot farther along in your goals. A lot of organizations use an annual 360 process, which can be great. However, I always encourage people to think less about, oh, it's survey time, and more about, why are you doing the survey? So if you do a survey and then you have reason to believe that someone has made progress, that might be a great time to do another check-in. One thing that we've seen some clients doing is, rather than following up with a full-blown 360 where you're asking about all of the relevant competencies, would be to do a 360 pulse. So for example, let's say you have a leader who has decided they're going to focus on their communication skills, and 6 months have gone by, they've been working really hard on it. You might do a Pulse 360 that's really just focused on a handful of questions around the communication competency. So the benefit there is you're getting more frequent, targeted feedback, and you're not putting as much burden on the raters of having to complete a full survey again.
So this would just be a real short survey to those same individuals who rated this person before, asking them on one specific topic, have you seen a change in my communication style?
That's right. Yep, short and sweet and really targeted.
Like that.
And then the last one here, we talked about at the beginning of using the same process for development and decision making. I had one client that said 360s had a bad reputation in her organization because it turned into this process of, oh, if you're being asked to do a 360, it's because you're in trouble or people think you're not doing well. And so keeping those processes separate can be a good idea to keep a really positive vibe around those developmental tools. Okay, so just real quickly to wrap up before we turn it over to questions. Of course, ways that New Measures and Survey Gizmo can help you with your initiative. Survey Gizmo has excellent 360 online data collection and reporting options. And then New Measures can help along the lines of helping you create that validated survey content that's appropriate for those who are going through the process. We can provide the benchmark data. If you have existing questions that you just want some additional eyes on, we can help with that. And of course, tailoring a 360 tool to your leadership model. And then along with that come all the support things that we've been talking about, including the coaching. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to see if there's any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Leanne. I found this just really insightful and helpful. So thank you for your tips and pitfalls to avoid there. Let's see, Alita, do you have any questions in chat?
We had just the ones that you tossed over. Let's keep going.
Okay. I think the key thing here is that competency leadership model that you had mentioned in the beginning, because that's, I think, the start of planning. Understand how you want to develop your employees, and that can be a great tool to start formulating your questions at each of the different levels. Mm-hmm. Is there a particular one you recommend? I know there's a lot out there. You can Google competency models, leadership models, and I think SHRM has a standard.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. Kouzes and Posner has a great leadership model. We have one that we've developed and validated on our own that's really focused around that, getting results and valuing people component. So there's a lot of good resources that are out there to use as a starting point.
Good. And then the other thing I just really would want to highlight too is 360s are very powerful and really coaching your staff, your supervisors, your managers on how to provide that feedback, as you mentioned, is so critical for these to be successful.
Absolutely.
So, thanks for your tips and your resources there. I don't think we have any other questions.
So that was very thorough. Thank you.
Yeah, Leanne, you brought a lot to the table, a lot to think about here. Our next webinar next week, it's November 9th, not next week, is on agile market research. Doing More with Less, and that's with Jeffrey Henning, founder and president of ResearchScape International, and he'll be talking about changes in the market research industry, and Agile being one of them. So we hope you can join us November 9th for that. I want to thank our audience for attending. You will receive the slide decks and the recording tomorrow morning. Thank you again, Leanne.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful, valuable tips here. And thank you, Alita, for your help answering people's questions directly. Also, we just want to do one more plug. November 2nd, if you want to learn how to use the Survey Gizmo 360 application, that webinar is November 2nd at 1 o'clock. Thank you all, and have a great day.